The story begins within the walls of a massive royal palace, where a young boy named Van suddenly jolts awake in a bed far too large for his small frame. As he slowly lifts his hands in front of his face, a strange sense of disorientation sets in. His hands are small, delicate, and unfamiliar. That's when it finally hits him. This isn't a dream. He's been reincarnated, pulled out of the bleak existence he once knew. In his previous life, Van had been trapped in a soul-crushing cycle, grinding away at a dead-end job just to get by. But now, fate has thrown him a second chance, one wrapped in luxury, status, and a noble name. Now reincarnated as a young noble in a distant village, Van carefully climbs out of bed and balances on a small wooden stool just to get a peek outside. The view stuns him. Tall buildings, endless land, and peaceful skies stretch as far as he can see. But before he can soak it all in, his maid Till bursts in, panicking at the sight of him standing up so high. After all, Van is supposed to be just 2 years old. But when he calmly responds with mature, articulate words, Till freezes in place, stunned by what she just heard. The moment he hears himself speak, Van realizes something even crazier. He doesn't just have memories from his old life. He actually remembers parts of his current one too. His past life in Japan is blending with the time he's already spent in this world, confirming beyond doubt that this reincarnation is real. Later that evening, Van joins his father and siblings at the dinner table. The atmosphere is tense, heavy with awkward silence. After a while, his father Jalpa breaks the ice by asking his second son Jard what he plans to study that day. Jard hesitates, then says he'll be focusing on fire magic and combat tactics. Jalpa nods and turns to the third son Sesto, who says he'll also be studying magic. Finally, Jalpa looks at Van and asks the same question. Without hesitation, Van replies that he still has a lot to learn, so he wants to begin by studying the kingdom's history and traditions. His brothers freeze as they stare at him, rattled by how a 2-year-old just gave a more thoughtful answer than either of them. Jalpa suddenly breaks into loud laughter, clearly amused and genuinely impressed by how sharp and promising Van is at such a young age. He says he's got high hopes that Van will end up inheriting the same strong fire magic talent that both he and Van's mother were born with. Jalpa then mentions that the magic aptitude test will happen when Van hits 8 years old, and he warns him not to mess it up. In this world, magical ability isn't just important, it's everything, and it's usually divided into 4 primary elements: fire, water, wind, and earth. While other forms exist, anything outside those 4 is seen as second-rate or even shameful. Once breakfast is over, Van heads off to his study, where the maids start giving him a basic rundown of how society and daily life work in this world. Just as they're finishing up, the head butler Esparta strides into the room and slams a thick stack of books onto Van's desk. Esparta is no ordinary servant. He's a veteran butler who's been working under Van's father for many years. Despite that, Van still finds him terrifying. Esparta then tells Van he's already aware that he's begun learning to read and do some basic math, so he bluntly asks how far he's gotten. Van admits he's still struggling with reading, and in terms of math, he can only handle simple addition and subtraction. But Esparta knows the kid's got more potential than that, so without asking, he decides to take over as Van's personal instructor. And from that day on, Van's life turns into a nightmare. The lessons are brutal, long hours, no breaks, no excuses. Still, those intense sessions pay off, as just within a few weeks, Van manages to read and write with ease. After grinding non-stop for 2 solid years, Van finally hits his 4th birthday and begins his sword training. At the start, he's completely hopeless. He keeps getting beaten, even by the maid during sparring practice. Still, he doesn't back down and shows up for training day after day without fail. And by the time he turns 5, all that hard work begins to show. He starts facing off against older boys, ones already in training to become soldiers, and can hold his own against them. Van realizes their moves are sloppy and easy to predict, so he beats them over and over again with little effort. The other kids are stunned by how good he is and start wondering if he's some kind of prodigy. What really sets him apart though, is that unlike his snobbish older brothers, Van actually talks to the commoner kids and treats them like equals, forming genuine friendships instead of acting like he's above them. Soon afterward, Van takes a moment to catch his breath and grabs a glass of water. Just then, the Deputy Knight Commander, D, steps into the room and politely asks to see Van's hands. As he carefully inspects them, D's expression tightens because there are no calluses, no bruises, so it's clear Van hasn't been wielding a sword for very long. Van confirms it, explaining that his time has mostly been swallowed up by endless studying. D tells him straight up that Esparta has been pushing him nearly 3 times harder than usual when it comes to academics, so D offers to speak with Esparta and suggest a better balance. Less time buried in books, more time on combat. After all, life isn't just about study. Then, with a confident smile, D swears that if Van gets the extra time, he'll personally shape him into a master swordsman. Van, however, politely declines the offer, saying he's confident he can handle both. D nods, impressed by his determination, and suggests that in that case, he'll become Van's official instructor to ensure his training stays sharp and focused. But training under D quickly spirals into another kind of torment. His drills are brutal, relentless, and leave no room for rest. But even so, Van pushes through. And deep down, he knows the truth. Despite all the exhaustion, every day in this new life has felt more rewarding than anything he experienced before. For the first time ever, he feels like he's actually living. And with that, Van silently promises himself that he's going to make this second chance count and enjoy every bit of it. 1 year afterward, Van turned 6. And by now, the constant cycle of back-to-back training and studying starts to wear on him. He begins to feel burned out, realizing that if things go on like this, he'll never experience the fun life he once dreamed of. So he makes a decision to start living like a normal child and carve out time to enjoy himself. Not long after, he tells one of the maids he wants to go outside and play. She takes him to the town market, and Van is blown away by the chaos and energy. The crowds, the chatter, the colorful goods on display everywhere. As they walk, his eyes lock onto a massive building towering above the stalls, the Merry Chamber of Commerce. He stares at it in awe, but before he can admire it too long, something unsettling happens. A child bound in shackles is being dragged through the crowd. Horrified, Van immediately asks the man what's going on. The man coldly replies that he's selling his own son into slavery, and since the boy belongs to him, he has every right to do as he pleases. The maid quietly explains that in poor families, this happens often. When they can't afford to raise their children, they sell them off to survive, and it's a heartbreaking reality of this world. Van admits it's painful to witness, but deep down, he also feels helpless because he knows there's little he can do to stop it. Just then, a lady named Rosalie stepped forward and politely greeted Van, saying it was a privilege to be at his service. Van turned to her and asked how much the man would be paid for selling his kid. Rosalie explained that the price varies based on the child's magical aptitude, and upon hearing that the boy possessed a thieving attribute, which was ranked among the lowest, she stated that he'd be worth no more than 3 silver coins. Enraged by this, the man lost it and began furiously kicking his shiny son, shouting at him for being damn useless. He then grabbed the boy by the arm and stormed off, saying they were going to try a different place. But before he could get far, Van stepped in and blocked his path, calmly stating that he would buy the boy for 5 silver coins. Without a second thought, the man accepted the deal, snatched the coins, and walked off without so much as a glance back. Van crouched down in front of the boy and introduced himself. The boy quietly replied, saying his name was Kamzan. Van then told him that he was free to go wherever he pleased. He never had any intention of keeping him. He just bought him so he could release him. But after learning that Kamzan had no place to return to, Van suggested he stay with him instead. One of the guards nearby voiced concern, warning Van that the Marquess might disapprove of him bringing a random boy into the estate. But if Kamzan were officially registered as Van's slave, then no one could object. Van turned to Kamzan and asked if that arrangement was alright with him, and Kamzan nodded. From that point on, Kamzan became Van's slave in name. Rosalie then reminded them that before finalizing anything, they had to complete the slave binding ritual. Both Van and Kamzan reached their hands out at the same time, and following Rosalie's directions, the contract was forged, and a faint glowing crest appeared on the back of Kamzan's hand. That symbol would remain there permanently as proof of their contract, for as long as it stayed in effect. Once it was done, Van brought Kamzan with him into the Chamber of Commerce to get him properly dressed and out of the ragged, grimy clothes of a street-bound slave. A few days later, back inside the royal estate, Van was about to enjoy a rare moment of calm and treat himself to a cookie. Just as he raised it to his mouth, Kamzan entered the room to report that D had shown up for training. Van instantly froze, and without even blinking, he handed the damn cookie to Kamzan as a bribe and told him to go outside and let D know he wasn't available, because the thought of facing another one of D's ruthless training sessions was unbearable. Kamzan nods and goes outside to deliver the message, which makes D look visibly disappointed. But since he's already here and eager to train someone, he grabs Kamzan and decides to start drilling him instead. 2 more years slip by, and Van finally hits his 8th birthday, the age when every noble child is tested for magical aptitude. Word of his upcoming test spreads like wildfire, sparking curiosity across the entire region. Nobles, servants, guards, and even common traders buzz with anticipation. Everyone expects great things from Van, especially with both of his parents being exceptional fire mages. His father Jalpa is especially confident. He's certain Van will inherit at least a fire affinity. But on the day of the test, the entire hall is stunned into silence. Against every expectation, Van shows no affinity for fire, water, wind, or earth. Instead, his only magical aptitude is for production magic, an ability ranked as the absolute lowest, widely mocked and dismissed as the most worthless form of magic there is. The room goes cold, and Jalpa's face twists with rage as the weight of disappointment crashes down. Without warning, he unsheathes his blade and charges forward, ready to strike Van down then and there. Frozen in place, Van can't speak, can't run, and his mind goes completely blank. But just before the blade falls, Mersha, the eldest son, steps in front of him and blocks the attack. Rather than let blood be spilled, Mersha suggests a different path. He suggests assigning Van to manage a remote village that recently came under their control. Mersha explains that the village is isolated and underdeveloped, and its people haven't yet sworn loyalty to the family, and by sending Van as its new lord, they could stabilize the region while keeping him out of the way. Jalpa pauses, then slowly lowers his sword as the idea sinks in. After a tense moment, he nods in agreement, saying the suggestion is reasonable. Without even looking at Van, he declares that from now on, Van will govern that land. Then he turns his back and orders Van to pack up and leave immediately, stating coldly that someone so useless has no place under his roof. Once Jalpa leaves, Mersha bows deeply and apologizes for making such a shameful suggestion. But Van stops him, saying there's no need for apologies because if Mersha hadn't stepped in, he'd be dead right now. The following morning, Van gathers his things and gets ready to head out to the remote village. But to his own surprise, he feels excited. He imagines it'll be a quiet place with little responsibility, where he might finally enjoy the peaceful, easy life he's always dreamed of. But that illusion gets crushed fast when Dee and Esparta announce they're coming along to continue his training and studies. Van lets out a long, exhausted sigh, already picturing the nightmare ahead. And as if that weren't enough, his favorite maid insists on tagging along too, saying she refuses to be separated from him. With everything packed and ready, Van climbs into the carriage and sets off toward a new chapter, still holding on to a tiny shred of hope that he'll finally catch a break and have a little fun. While the carriage rolls gently through the quiet forest, Van leans back and decides to fiddle with some production magic to pass the time. With a bit of focus, he conjures a tiny sword in the palm of his hand. Kamzin watches calmly, not even blinking since he's already seen what Van's capable of and knows just how quickly he picks up new skills. But beneath the calm ride and casual magic, something heavier finally slips out. With everything that's gone down, being exiled, losing his title, Van admits there's really no reason for Kamzin to stay bound to him anymore. If he doesn't want to keep traveling or feels uneasy sticking around, Van says he's ready to end the slave contract and give him the freedom to live however he likes. But Kamzin instantly shuts the idea down without even thinking twice. He firmly tells Van that he already chose this path and didn't do it on a whim. He makes it clear that he'd gladly throw his life on the line if it meant keeping Van safe, no matter what kind of trouble they run into. Hearing that, Van has no choice but to respect Kamzin's loyalty, though part of him still feels uneasy about it. Out of nowhere, the carriage jerks to a stop, throwing everyone off balance. Van glances out the window and spots chaos up ahead. The village they were heading toward is under siege. The knights traveling with him immediately assume it's a raid, probably just a bunch of low-level bandits or washed-up mercenaries looking for something easy to steal. Dee scans the attackers' formation and does a quick head count, around 50 of them. Judging by the numbers, he figures that if they all launched a coordinated assault, they'd have a good shot at wiping out the enemy without much hassle. So tactically speaking, it looks doable. But one of the adventurers in their group, a guy named Ortho, isn't on board with that idea. He reminds Dee that their orders were straightforward from the start. Protect Van if he's in danger. Right now, Van isn't hurt, and no one's coming after him directly. So as far as Ortho's concerned, jumping into a fight that isn't their responsibility would be a reckless waste of lives, and way outside the scope of their agreement. Dee's expression tightens with frustration, but even so, he declares that he's going in. He says he can't just sit back and watch while innocent villagers are butchered right in front of him. Whether anyone follows him or not, he's ready to charge in alone. But before he can take off, he asks the adventurers to stay put and make sure Van's protected in case things spiral out of control. Just as Dee prepares to move, Esparta suddenly speaks up and shuts the whole idea down. Esparta cuts straight to the point, telling Dee that throwing himself into a reckless fight like that would be downright idiotic, especially given how vital he is to the kingdom. If Dee dies here, it'd cripple their military's future. As a renowned and highly capable elemental mage, Esparta lays out a smarter approach. He suggests building a powerful defensive barrier around their position to keep Van secure, while the adventurers provide ranged cover from behind the shield to chip away at the attackers. Once the enemy's focus shifts entirely to their front, Dee and the knights would break off and hit them with a surprise assault from the right flank. Esparta is confident that, if they pull it off properly, it'll lead to a clean victory. But Van quickly catches what this plan actually means. For the enemy to focus on one spot, someone would need to stay out in the open as bait. That someone is Esparta himself, and Esparta confirms Van's suspicion, explaining that unless he takes on that role, Dee and the others would be dragged into a straight-up brawl and probably won't make it out alive. Hearing that, Van fully grasps the weight of what Esparta is putting on the line. If something goes wrong, Esparta would be the one paying the price with his life, and losing both the kingdom's top strategist and its strongest warrior in one battle would be a devastating loss, one that the land might never recover from. With that in mind, Van steps forward and insists on taking the decoy role himself. Tilly instantly rejects the idea the second it leaves his mouth, stating flat out that she'd rather take the risk than let Van put himself in the line of fire. Kamzin agrees without hesitation, standing tall beside Van. But even with their protests, Van gently tells them both that he values them far too much. And that's exactly why he can't allow either of them to take that risk for his sake. Van lays out his own plan. Next, he'll ride straight into the enemy lines using the carriage as bait, drawing their full attention while the others hit them from long range and both sides. As he turns to walk away, he reminds them that he didn't spend years training with a sword for nothing, and he's confident he can handle himself in a direct fight. Still, somewhere deep inside, he quietly accepts that if this really is where his story ends, he'd be at peace with it, so long as it's for something worth dying for. Ortho stares after him, stunned by the sheer recklessness of the idea. Hearing those words takes him back to his days at the guild, the day he first received the mission to guard Van. At the time, he absolutely despised the idea. To him, all nobles were arrogant scum not worth lifting a blade for. But since he planned on operating in the Fertio March anyway, he took the job. What he didn't expect was Van himself. He still remembers the young noble walking up to him, bowing with sincerity, and thanking him from the bottom of his heart. No arrogance, no airs, just honest gratitude. Van had even gone out of his way to praise Ortho's skills, treating him not like a servant, but like an equal. It was the first time Ortho realized that maybe not all nobles were rotten. Snapping back to the present, Ortho moves in front of Van and refuses flat out. He says there's no way in hell they're letting some kid throw himself into danger like that. Dee and Esparta step up right after, siding with Ortho without hesitation. With that, the original plan gets tossed out. Esparta takes charge and quickly draws up a new strategy. He'll summon a defensive wall around their group, shielding Van. Behind it, the adventurers will rain down long-range attacks to thin the enemy ranks. At the same time, Dee and his knights will strike from the left, while Ortho leads a second charge from the right. They waste no time, and Esparta slams his staff to the ground and erects a massive magical barrier. From behind it, arrows and spells start flying, taking out a wave of bandits before they even realize what hit them. Chaos erupts as the rest scramble to respond, just in time to see Dee and his squad slice through their front lines like butter. But right in the middle of the mess, the bandit leader breaks through the formation and charges past the wall, heading straight for Pluriel. But just as his weapon swings down, Van jumps in, intercepting him at the last second. His blade flashes, slicing through the man's Achilles tendon and sending him crashing to the ground in agony. And before the thug can even cry out, Kamzan follows up with a crushing blow that finishes him off for good. Soon after the fighting ends, the last of the bandits are rounded up and tied down, completely neutralizing the threat to the village. With the danger behind them and the mission technically complete, some of the adventurers decide it's time to move on, eager to take on new jobs elsewhere. But Ortho lingers, clearly impressed, not just by Van's swordplay, but by how calmly and decisively he led the group during the battle. That spark of curiosity grows into admiration, and Ortho decides to stick around a bit longer, offering his support to Van directly. His party members agree without hesitation, choosing to stay and lend their strength as well. Once things settle, Van steps up to formally introduce himself to the village as their new lord. He addresses the village chief, a man named Rhonda, and thanks him for allowing them to help. Rhonda, still shaken but grateful, expresses his heartfelt thanks to Van for saving their lives. He then shares something troubling. It turns out this wasn't the first time their village had been attacked. In fact, this year alone, it's happened more than once. According to Rhonda, things were far safer when their village was still under Ferdinando County. Back then, the area was patrolled by knights who acted as a strong deterrent against bandits. But now, those patrols are long gone, and with them, the village's only real line of defense. Van lowers his head and apologizes to Rhonda and the others for the state they've been left in. He explains that this situation likely arose because the current Marquis has no idea what conditions are like in these smaller, out-of-the-way villages. But now that Van has been appointed as their new lord, he swears not to turn a blind eye to their struggles. He goes on to outline 3 possible paths they can take to secure their future. The first is to produce something valuable enough that the kingdom itself wouldn't dare ignore them. The second is to raise enough money to hire mercenaries for protection. And the third is to focus on building the village up from within, strengthening their infrastructure and community to stand strong on their own. But before the villagers can react, a young girl in the crowd speaks up. She says they've already considered those options in the past. While they sound promising, she explains, the reality is much harsher. They've found that putting such plans into action is far more difficult than it sounds. Van does his best to rally their spirits, promising that things will be different now that he's here. He assures them that he won't just talk about change, he'll make it happen. Still, his words alone don't seem to sway the villagers, many of whom remain unsure. Sensing their doubt, Esparta and Dee step forward. Standing tall, they formally introduce themselves, Dee as the kingdom's chief commander, and Esparta as the royal head butler. With firm voices, they back Van's declaration and promise the villagers that this isn't some empty gesture. They assure Rhonda and the others that with them here, there's no reason to fear anything. Hearing the support of Dee and Esparta lifts the villagers' spirits right away. But it doesn't take long before another concern surfaces. One of them steps forward and hesitantly asks what will be done about taxes, explaining how hard it's been just to survive while giving up 30% of their harvest every season. Without skipping a beat, Van answers that starting immediately, the tax rate will be lowered to just 10%. He calmly explains that ensuring a safe, livable environment comes first. Everything else can wait. The villagers go silent, stunned by the sudden generosity. A cut that deep, to less than a third of what they used to pay, is something they never imagined possible. Gratitude quickly spreads among the crowd, and for the first time in a while, their hope feels real. As for the village safety, Esparta wastes no time and conjures a thick, reinforced stone wall that surrounds the entire settlement, standing tall as a bulwark against any future attacks. Then he mentions that adding a moat would strengthen their defenses even further. Dee and the knights step in right after, volunteering to dig it out themselves. Van turns back to the villagers and tells them clearly that if they're willing to work together, he's confident they can transform this place into something far greater than it's ever been. Once things calm down, Van decides to test his production magic again. After a bit of focus, he crafts several wooden-looking blocks, but they're far from ordinary. These are made of nanofibers, a rare and ridiculously tough material. When Ortho tries slamming one with his sword, the blade bounces off without even leaving a scratch. Encouraged by the result, Van spends the rest of the day crafting weapons, each one as polished and precise as a royal armory piece. Watching him work, Tilly starts to worry he might burn himself out. But Van just smiles and assures her he's fine. He remembers reading that production magic usually eats through mana like crazy, and most people struggle to make even a single object without passing out, so clearly, Van's built a talent for it. As a finishing touch, he crafts a beautiful sword and offers it to Kamzan, who accepts it with both hands, promising to cherish it for the rest of his life. Tilly gets jealous, so Van hands her an axe, but one glance at her face makes it obvious she's not thrilled. That night, Van rests by the campfire, but his whole body aches from sleeping rough. Glancing at Tilly and Kamzan as they sleep, he can tell they've been putting on a brave face, but they're exhausted too. That's when he makes up his mind. It's time to build a real home. The following morning, Van gets to work. Using the nanoblocks, he and the others begin laying out the foundation. When Chief Rhonda passes by and sees the progress, he remarks that it's shaping up to be the perfect location for the Lord's mansion, and hearing that makes Van's heart swell with pride. He takes a moment to analyze the structure with his magic, carefully measuring the layout and scanning each block down to the last inch. Once everything feels right, Van activates his magic in full. In the blink of an eye, the entire structure assembles itself in front of their eyes, a fully built mansion rising from the ground like a miracle. Everyone stares in wide-eyed silence, unable to process what they just witnessed. Van glances up at the massive building, scratching his head a little, thinking that maybe he went just a little overboard. No one can even begin to figure out how Van managed to put together a full-on mansion in such a ridiculously short time. It sounds unbelievable to the point where people honestly think it shouldn't be possible. Still, one conclusion becomes unavoidable. His production magic isn't just convenient, it's insanely effective for governing a territory. Compared to that, flashy elemental spells start to feel almost pointless. Van admits it's an impressive talent, but deep down, he still believes real security comes from offensive power. To him, people feel safe when their ruler has the strength to stand on the front lines and wipe out any threat. But his friends shut that down real quick. Then Esparta points out that while that might be true during times of war, what people really want is a lord who'll improve their day-to-day lives. And in that sense, he says no one fits the role better than Van. What Van just pulled off was nothing short of miraculous, and Ortho straight up says that his powers are way beyond anything a normal production magic user could ever dream of. But Van isn't stopping there. He says if they bring him enough lumber, he can build houses for everyone. The others are floored, and Ortho and Dee immediately order their men to start hauling in materials. The villagers, of course, are all in. Their homes are falling apart anyway, and Van quickly realizes he may have just volunteered himself for a massive workload. Still, seeing the conditions they're living in, he makes up his mind to transform the entire village from the ground up. He agrees to build a home for every single family, and the celebration kicks off right away. Van gets to work, cranking out house after house, and people can't believe how much mana he's burning through like it's nothing. Even more impressive is his knowledge of urban planning. He explains the grid layout he's using, with each unit made of 4 houses and wide roads running between each block. It's efficient, clean, and organized. Van says these wooden homes will do for now, but once they have a steady supply of stone, he'll upgrade them all to suit each family's needs. And because he wanted to enjoy a proper bath himself, he went ahead and built a bathhouse next to his mansion, keeping the design simple while Pluriel helped out by filling the tub with water magic. Later, after taking a bath, Van finally gets to crash in a proper bed, clean and satisfied. The following day, Van finds out the knights managed to dig a trench around the entire village. He's impressed, but notes that filling it with water would make it even better, a full moat for defense. Plus, they'll need a proper water source for drinking and bathing, and that locks in their next goal. Without missing a beat, Van says it's time to secure a water source. Thanks to Esparta's insane strength, they're able to divert water from a nearby river in no time. He digs a solid few meters of trench instantly, while Dee and the rest help extend it by hand. Van followed close behind, reinforcing the bottom and sides of the canal to make sure it wouldn't collapse. The distance between the river and the village was no joke, and Tilly couldn't help but point out how massive a job this really was. Still, Van just shrugs it off because people need water, plain and simple. It's grueling work, but there's something uplifting about seeing everyone come together and push for the same goal. Besides, once the infrastructure is solid and life in the village becomes more stable, it'll be way easier for merchants to stop by. And for Van, that's crucial because if trade picks up, he might finally get to enjoy the slow, peaceful lifestyle he's been dreaming of. He estimates the canal work will take about a week, but then one of the workers casually mentions they can already see the village from where they're digging. That completely catches Van off guard, so he calls it a day right then, thinking the crew could use some rest. But Dee is still raring to go. He insists they could hit the village in just a few more hours if they keep pushing. But Van notices how drained the others are and tells Dee to chill. No sense in knocking everyone out cold. Dee admits this whole thing feels like a new form of training, but even he realizes they shouldn't push past their limits. By the next morning, Van proudly announces that the canal is officially done. He gathers everyone together, thanks them for their hard work, and gives Esparta the signal to open the water gate. A rush of clean river water flows in, and the villagers look on in awe. The moat is now fully operational, surrounding the village and adding a serious layer of defense. Van can't help but worry that it might overflow during heavy rain, so he floats the idea of building a lake behind the village to handle the excess. Esparta actually thinks it's a great idea. A lake could double as a reservoir for dry seasons too. Van jumps on it immediately, getting to work and creating a proper water source that shocks the entire village. Just like that, a place that used to have no water system now has a freaking lake. Thanks to Van, the villagers no longer need to hike out to the river every day just to fill their buckets. The village chief tries to thank him, but Van waves it off. He's just happy that life is finally starting to feel manageable for everyone here. Later that night, we shift scenes to a girl named Lady Art, traveling alongside someone called Panamera. They're making their way toward a distant frontier village, and while the journey's still far from over, Panamera suggests that Art should get some rest before they continue. The following morning, Van wraps up construction on a massive defensive wall known as the Rampart. What used to be nothing more than a plain dirt barrier has now transformed into a seriously solid structure. With a wide enough top to allow patrolling, the guards can now walk across it like it's a fortress wall. Everyone's buzzing with excitement because this thing is no joke. It's so sturdy that even if bandits show up, the villagers won't have to lose sleep over it. But Van is not content just yet. He wants to push it even further and make the village feel completely untouchable. Van then experiments with crafting simple crossbows, or at least that's what he calls them. But when he's done, nobody can believe what they're seeing. These things are anything but basic. They're clean, powerful, and even come equipped with shields on the front, letting guards shoot while staying safely behind cover. The moment they see these, everyone realizes just how insane Van's production magic really is. Their village may be tiny, but it's starting to resemble a fully fortified city. Everyone's in full agreement that some random bandit gang wouldn't stand a chance no matter how bold they get. Dee even jokes that if the king had half a clue about what Van was capable of, he wouldn't have kicked him out to this backwater place. He would have put him in charge of the entire family. The king may have dismissed him as weak, but one glance at the changes in this village makes it obvious Van's strength isn't just practical, it's battle-ready. Dee insists that Van might be stronger than anyone they've ever seen, while Esparta argues his real talent lies in defense. The two start bickering, but Van steps in and calms them down. He reminds them there's no point in complaining about how things turned out. They've got what they've got, so they'd better make it work and stand tall. Right then, Van's stomach growls like it's declaring war, so Tilly heads off to cook something for the crew. But it's a struggle because supplies are running low. Esparta mentions that while defense is great and all, they need to figure out a steady income source for the village. Right now, they're cut off from the world aside from a couple of merchants who show up once a month. Van brushes it off at first, thinking their crops can handle the village's needs. But then Esparta mentions something critical. They don't have the ingredients to make Van's favorite sweet baked treats. That gets his attention fast because the idea of living without those sweets is basically a nightmare. So Van instantly does a 180 and declares that it's time to come up with a solid product the village can sell. Kamzan then suggests selling the wood blocks that Van crafts with his magic, but Van instantly shuts that idea down. No one else can manipulate them the way he can, so it wouldn't work. One by one, the others pitch in their ideas, but Van can already tell that finding something unique and valuable enough to market as this village specialty won't be easy. Afterward, Van finds out that Tilly and Kamzan have been avoiding using their weapons. Since they were gifts from him, neither of them wants to risk damaging them. But Van reminds them that the whole point of having weapons is to know how to fight with them, so they've got to get some practice in. Zara tells him not to stress and shows them the shield made from the Orc Knight. It's both tough and flexible, so it won't mess up their weapons too badly even when he blocks. Kamzan steps up first, and his swing has no power behind it at all. Yet somehow, the shield gets knocked to the ground, sliced clean in two. Everyone just stares because a hit with zero force shouldn't do that kind of damage. And the fact that a wooden sword could do that kind of damage with a half-hearted swing stuns everyone, Van included. Van patches up the shield, and not long after, Ortho shows up to see what the fuss is about. He's carrying some ores they recently mined and wants to know if Van is interested in buying them. Ortho explains that the woods around the nearby mountains are crawling with dangerous monsters, which is why most folks avoid the area. But since no one's been mining there, the place is rich with untouched resources. They came back with iron, copper, silver, and even a little gold. But what really catches Van off guard is when Ortho says they found mithril ore. If that's just from the foothills, then the deeper mountain range must be packed with valuable materials. Van takes a bit of the iron ore and stuns the group by instantly turning it into a solid block of metal. He admits he didn't refine it before molding it, so he's not sure how pure the result is. Still, Zara's hyped and asks if Van can forge him a sword out of it. Feeling a little guilty about the busted shield, Van agrees. Zara requests both a long sword and a short one, so Van gets started. It's his first time crafting with iron, so he really has to focus. He carefully visualizes the design and edge, and before long, he finishes. And since Zara's his very first customer, Van even put in extra effort to make the swords look great. Zara's thrilled with the short sword, and Van moves on to the next. It turns out just as good, and now all the other adventurers are lining up, wanting weapons of their own. Van reminds them that since they're the ones who gathered the ores, it's only fair he makes their gear. Once he's done, it's obvious to everyone that Van could easily sell these weapons for a fortune. Then he shifts his gaze to the mithril ore, wondering just how incredible a weapon made from that would turn out. Isparta is immediately fascinated by the mithril, mostly because he's never heard of metallic ores being mined in a forest. The only logical explanation is that there's a dungeon nearby. He tells Van that if they manage to locate one, everything about their situation would flip overnight. A steady stream of people, trade, and opportunity would flood in, turning their quiet little village into a bustling hub. That possibility gets Van fired up, because finding a dungeon would skyrocket the village's value and status. Dungeons are packed with high-grade resources and gems that can rival national treasures. Normally, whenever the guild catches wind of a new dungeon, they rush to establish a branch in the nearest settlement. But Van brings up the hard truth. The village just isn't equipped to handle that kind of influx right now. Isparta agrees, since bringing in the guild would mean waves of adventurers, merchants, and even knights showing up. And with their current setup, they barely have the food, space, or infrastructure to support any of them. Worse, if word got out too soon, a rival country might try to invade, hoping to snatch control of the dungeon before the village can do anything about it. And then there's Van's personal dilemma. He's considered a disgrace by his family, so if his father finds out that the village he was exiled to actually has value, there's no doubt he'd be shipped off somewhere else. That's why Van decides they need to develop the village and produce results first, before any dungeon discovery changes the game. Ortho totally gets it. He says they'll steer clear of the suspected dungeon area while gathering materials, just to be safe. Van knows the adventurers could easily report this and gain favor with the guild, so he genuinely respects that they're holding back to protect the village. Sometime later, Van looks around, satisfied with the progress they've made. He smiles and says their dramatic village makeover is officially complete. Tilly stares at him, half in disbelief, and asks if he's seriously not out of mana yet after cranking out weapons and houses non-stop. But Van just waves it off, saying he's only a little worn out. Right then, a breathless messenger rushes in with urgent news. Armored lizards are headed straight for the village. Van doesn't hesitate and shouts for everyone to get behind the walls, orders the drawbridge raised, and has the gates sealed. The villagers are visibly shaken. They've all heard how deadly those creatures can be, and panic spreads fast. But Van stays calm. He knows fear is natural, but reminds them that the lives of their friends and families depend on what they choose to do now. He promises to fight for them all, but he's also honest. He can't do this alone. That's why he asks them to stand with him. If they want to keep this village safe, they'll need to fight for it. The villagers roar with resolve after Van's speech, fully charged and ready to fight tooth and nail to protect their land. Van doesn't hesitate, and he sends them running to the front lines and has them lock in behind the ballistae. That's when Kamzan steps up and tells him Ortho's squad is still out hunting, so someone's gotta take command. Van decides he'll go with them and direct things, but just as he's about to move, Tilly clutches his arm, eyes glassy and on the verge of breaking. Van's not the kind of guy to get swayed by emotions, but he's not heartless either, so he doesn't pull away. Instead, he snaps toward D and tells him to get to the wall and report everything back in real time. Van remains on the ground, barking out commands while D rushes to the wall and freezes in disbelief at what he sees. He radios back to Van, reporting that a swarm of around 40 armored lizards is closing in fast. Each one towers at about 8 meters, practically 3 elephants stacked in a trench coat. Dee's nerves start to crack because he knows even a squad of elite knights would struggle with one of these monsters, and right now, they're severely outmanned. Van orders him to load the iron bolts into the heavy ballistae, and Dee jumps to it without hesitation. The knights nearby warn him that normal weapons are useless against those rock-hard scales, and Dee knows that damn well. But still, he decides to trust Van's call. For once, he puts his instincts aside and lets Van take the reins. He shouts for everyone to ready their shots, and gives the order to fire. The bolts slam into the monsters and disappear. For a second, Dee thinks they've failed, but then he sees clean, gaping holes where the arrows struck. The hulking lizards take a few staggering steps before collapsing under their own momentum. Just in that opening barrage, 10 of them drop. Dee is floored by the sheer firepower of Van's gear. Wasting no time, he rallies the team for another volley. But the knights quickly tell him they've only got one more iron bolt per launcher. Dee doesn't flinch, and he tells them to reload and shoot anyway, and once again, they nail several more targets. But it's not enough because half the lizards are still marching, and now they're out of ammo. Dee reports back, and Van instantly starts working through the problem. That's when it hits him. Khamzan's wooden sword had sliced clean through Zara's top-tier shield, so maybe those wooden bolts might do the trick. He tells Dee to switch to the wooden ones. The knights look at him like he's lost his mind because wood against armor thicker than steel is suicide. Dee shuts them down hard, telling them to quit whining because Van's already proven himself more than once, and right now, he's putting his full faith in the guy. He orders the villagers to load the wooden bolts and fire. To everyone's shock, even the wooden arrows sink halfway into the beasts. That alone is enough to hit something vital and drop them instantly. Dee realizes right then that there's no stopping them, so he roars out for another round, declaring that tonight, they'll be dining on fresh lizard steak. The villagers waste no time, raining down bolt after bolt, finishing off whatever's still breathing. Dee announces their win to Van and the rest of the crew. Cheers erupt from the crowd as Tilly rushes over and clings to Van, while he's still trying to wrap his head around the fact that his wooden gear actually took down monsters built like tanks. Up on the wall, the knights can't believe their luck. No injuries, and still plenty of ammo in stock. Dee feels a weird mix of pride and letdown because the fight ended way too fast. But all that really proves is how busted Van's creations are. A little while later, Ortho's party finally gets back and takes charge of breaking down the fallen beasts. Ortho tells everyone to salvage the good stuff. Their eyes, fangs, scales, and magic cores for selling. But the meat will be stored for food. Normally, carving up armored lizards is a long, grueling job that ends with half the meat rotting. But with Van's specially made knives, they're cutting through like butter. Right around then, Van shows up, inspects the massive pile of meat, and decides to throw a feast to celebrate. Once night falls, the village comes alive with celebration. Everyone's eating their fill of lizard meat. Ortho's crew joins Van and tells him that the weapons he crafted for them are absolutely killing it in the field. Dee catches that and raises an eyebrow, asking if Van gave them gear before making anything for him. Ortho's guys start flexing their swords like proud kids on Christmas morning. Dee, not hiding his jealousy, begs Van to make him a sword too, and says he'll literally write him a blank check. The other knights quickly jump in, wanting their own weapons as well. Van, a little flustered, tells them he can't take their money and he's kind of swamped right now, but he promises to hook them up with new equipment once things settle down in the village, and the knights are more than happy with that. Afterward, Ortho gives Van the breakdown that normally each armored lizard goes for about 20 gold coins, but since a chunk of the meat always rots, they'll get closer to 8 coins apiece. Even then, that's a fat stack of cash. Van starts sweating at the thought of managing all that gold because it's more than he's ever dealt with in his life. Esparta hits him with a gut punch. Apparently once a village earns more than 100 gold coins, they're legally bound to cough up half of it to the marquis in taxes. Van feels like he just got rug pulled in some shady crypto scheme and immediately asks if there's a loophole they can abuse to dodge the taxman. Esparta shuts him down, saying there's no way to hide that much monster loot, and Van slumps, already imagining his father catching wind of the village's value and shipping him off to some forgotten corner of the map. But just then, Esparta sparks up with an idea. What if they just report to Mercia instead of Jalpa? Van catches on fast that if they hand over the credit for the armored lizard massacre to his older brother, they can keep flying under the radar and stick around here a little longer. The very next day, a pair of merchants roll into the village, and the second they lay eyes on the towering fortress walls, they start arguing over who messed up the map and sent them off track. That's when Van casually steps onto the gate and welcomes them like a proper lord. The two merchants freeze, completely stunned. They recognize Van instantly, the prodigy son of the Marquis, and are baffled as hell to find him holed up in the middle of nowhere. They introduce themselves as Belle and Rango from the Merry Chamber of Commerce, and Van opens the gates to let them in. Once they reach the warehouse and catch sight of the piles of armored lizard materials, their jaws just about hit the ground. They can't wrap their heads around how this tiny village bagged so many monsters. But Van cuts to the chase and asks if they're interested in buying the goods. Without missing a beat, the merchants say yes, but they'll need a month to bring a crew to appraise and transport the haul. Van's cool with that and even tells them to take some meat on the house since it'll spoil anyway. He then walks them over to a stash of weapons up for grabs, and the quality hits them like a truck. They immediately agree to his price, no haggling, no questions. Van just tells them to spread the word. That's when the brothers start hesitating, clearly thinking they can keep the place under wraps and make a killing by cornering the sword market. Van sees right through them and tells them straight that trying to keep it secret won't work. People will figure it out the moment they track the merchant's travel route. The brothers blink in shock, and Van throws them a better pitch. If they really want to rake in cash, they should open up shop right here in the village. The brothers jump at the offer without a second thought, bowing deeply in front of Van to show their thanks. But before they can even process what's happening, Van casually tells them to start building their shop immediately. Then, with a smug grin, he snaps his fingers and conjures the exact store they'd always dreamed of owning. He pats them on the back and says he's looking forward to doing some solid business together. Not long after, Van gets a surprise visit from two unexpected guests. One is a noble girl around his age, and the other is a total warrior queen of a knight, standing guard beside her. The Night Lady instantly starts judging everything and makes it clear she's here to figure out if Van's really a prodigy or just another overhyped fraud. At the same time, Van's dealing with a whole different headache. Esparta just handed him an assignment to design a city fit for 10,000 people. With the way the village is growing, it won't be long before they're running a full-blown metropolis. Esparta asks what kind of fortress Van has in mind, noting that square-shaped layouts are the standard. But Van's never been one to do things by the book. He says he wants a star-shaped fortress instead. That way, invaders will be forced to waste time trying to hit multiple defensive points scattered across the structure. Esparta actually likes the concept and jumps in to help with the planning. But then their brainstorm gets cut short. The redhead knight storms into the room and announces that someone from Ferdinando County is requesting a meeting. Van gives the okay, and sure enough, it's the same noble girl and the Night Lady from before. He welcomes them properly, and the knight steps forward to introduce herself as Panamera, a former knight who earned the title of Viscountess through pure grit. The girl quietly introduces herself as Art, the youngest daughter of Count Ferdinando, and Van politely offers them seats. Panamera dives straight into business and asks Van if he knows why they're here. He guesses they came to evaluate him, and if they find him useful or dangerous, they'll try to bring him over to their side. She laughs out loud, impressed he hit the nail on the head. She explains that Count Ferdinando suspects Mark Jalpa sent his star child here to claim new territory. But she personally believes it's the opposite, that Van was dumped here because he doesn't have any elemental magic. Van decides to be honest. He admits that yeah, he's got no elemental powers, and no, he's not leading some invasion. He was flat out exiled by his own father. But Panamera raises an eyebrow. After all, no powerless exile could have developed this place so quickly. She says it looks like he showed up with 5,000 soldiers and turned the village into a mini military outpost. Van bursts into laughter, then apologizes and tells her the truth. He was kicked out of the family with just his bags and a good luck, and not a single person came to say goodbye. Panamera glances around and sarcastically asks if she's hallucinating the butler and knight commander in the corner. Dee answers first, explaining he chose to train Van on his own and has been ignoring orders to return to the capital. Esparta follows up, saying he's retired now and is teaching Van just for fun. Then Tilly chimes in, saying she'll serve Van forever because he treats everyone with respect, no matter their background. But even with all that, it still doesn't explain the crazy fast progress, and Van knows it, so he tells them to hold tight. A live demonstration will be quicker than a long-winded explanation. He leads them outside the village and asks Esparta to raise an earthen wall, planning to upgrade it into something worthy of a fortress. Panamera is surprised by the old butler's skill, but points out the wall won't last long once the mana fades. Van doesn't waste a second and taps into his magic and hardens the mud wall into reinforced concrete, then uses wood nanocubes to slap together a proper gate. Panamera and Art are left blinking in disbelief. They turn to Van and ask what kind of magic he's packing. He tells them it's production magic, the kind of magic everyone laughs at, which is exactly why he got dumped in this village. That hits a nerve for Art, who quietly remembers her own rough past. Before the mood sinks, Panamera brings up her real reason for coming. She says the Count sent her to propose a marriage between Van and Art. Van gets the message loud and clear. This is the Count's way of roping him in so he won't end up becoming a threat. Van politely turns her down, saying there's no need for marriage since he has zero interest in war. All he wants is to build up the village and live in peace. Panamera admits she was against the idea at first. Art marrying the lord of some backwater village sounded like a nightmare. But now that she's seen what Van is capable of, she's changed her mind. She starts showering him with praise, calling him sharp, dependable, and tough as nails for turning exile into opportunity. She even jokes that if it were allowed, she'd marry him herself. Van lights up at the thought of scoring a hot older waifu, but sadly, it's Art or bust. Panamera looks at Art and gently asks if she'd consider marrying Van. After all, guys like him don't grow on trees. Art turns red and admits that Van's a good man, but she's never really thought about marriage before. Van tells her not to rush it. This kind of decision isn't something to wing in one night. Panamera agrees, saying they'll spend the night in the village to think things over. That throws Van off, but when she asks if there's a guest room in the mansion, he ditches that idea and decides to just build them a whole damn inn instead. Later at dinner, Van decides to learn more about his potential bride-to-be. Art tells him she's into cute stuff, like flowers and dolls. Van smiles and asks if he can check out her collection. Art lights up and happily agrees to show him the dolls in her carriage. It's the first time in a while someone's taken real interest in her. Afterward, Van walks them to the inn and Panamera quietly steps away, leaving the two alone. Art tells Van he's sweet, then dashes into her room all flustered. Van heads back to the mansion, where Esparta tells him something that clicks hard. Since the Count was willing to marry off his daughter to a nobody, she's probably not an elemental mage either. That's when it hits Van. Art must have been cast out too. Whether or not they end up getting engaged, he decides she can stay in the village if she wants to. That concludes this episode. Thank you for watching. If you want to see the next part, be sure to subscribe to the channel and turn on the notification bell.